Welcome back, everyone, to An Ordinary Search for Truth. My name is Nate, and today we'll be taking a more logical route to absolute truth, asking a few questions and trying to reason out some answers. It's my second video in a three-part video series that I'm doing to kind of kickstart my channel after I've shifted away from previous content that I was doing and more toward what I want my channel to actually be all about. So I'll be doing a little bit of reading, so I might not be making as much eye contact today with you because I want to be very specific in what I'm saying, especially when we're doing this kind of logical reasoning. So I've got an outline here on my computer that I'll be looking at. When we're talking about absolute truth, we first, as I kind of did in my previous videos, you kind of have to start looking at it from a linguistic point of view. To what exactly are we referring to when we use the words absolute and truth? So I did online dictionary search on both of these words through various sources to kind of see what these words are trying to convey. So absolute is typically referring to not relative, which is very important, foundational, unquestionable. I love that one. Unquestionable. Ultimate in regards to reality. Pure, perfect, complete, unlimited. That's a great one as well. Independent existence. Certain, total, unconditional, and universal. So absolute is very absolute. And when referring to truth, that truth is referring to fact or reality. I prefer using reality. What is real? What is actual? What is indisputable? Also, existence. I find that interesting that truth can also be equated with existence. I love that. So when we're talking about absolute truth, we're talking about truth that is not relative. And let me tell you, there's a lot of relative truth. A lot, an infinite amount. But absolute truth is that truth which is not relative. That truth which has independent existence. It's not dependent on anything else. It just is what it is, eternally. Always has been, always will be, is now. That's what we're talking about. So now that we kind of understand what these words are trying to convey, we have to ask, is there absolute truth, or is all truth relative? To claim that nothing is absolute would itself have to be absolutely true, which is an interesting paradox. To say that there is absolutely no absolute truth is a paradox. So that's where we're starting. If all truth was relative, then even the truth that all truth is relative would itself be relative, and thus would allow for certain cases of the truth to not be relative, and thus be absolute. Just from a logical point of view, there has to be absolute truth. We cannot have just relative truth. Something has to be absolutely true. If there is absolute truth, and I'm stating that there is, can absolute truth be known by us? That's the next question I wanted to ask. Again, to state that you know absolutely that absolute truth cannot be known reaffirms not only that absolute truth exists, but also that your knowledge about being unable to know that absolute truth exists is itself an absolute truth that must be known. To put it in simpler words, if you know absolutely that absolute truth can't be known, then you already know some absolute truth. So it's a paradox once again. The most that you can really say logically is that you don't know if absolute truth can be known, which leaves room for the possibility that it can, even if you may not necessarily know that. So we've reasoned that there must be absolute truth logically. And to know that affirms that at least the concept of absolute truth can be known absolutely on a purely conceptual level. So conceptually, we can know that there is absolute truth, and because we know that absolutely, then at least that absolute truth can be known. So then the question becomes, can absolute truth be known beyond merely a conceptual understanding? And if it can be, then can that understanding then be communicated using concepts? Language itself is a conceptual medium that we use to communicate our experience. So, if absolute truth can be known, can we communicate that with language or any other means? And how do we go about doing so? The next question I asked is there absolute truth beyond merely the conceptual absolute truth that there is absolute truth? I know I'm saying absolute truth a lot, but hang in there. We're just trying to look at this from as logical a standpoint as I could come up with. The absolute truth that there is absolute truth is self-affirming. So absolute truth cannot, as defined, be dependent upon anything else for its existence, and thus it is self-existing and self-perpetuating and self-affirming. Just by being what it is absolutely true. And it is also all-inclusive. So it must contain all absolute truth that there is. So we might call that absolute truth with a capital A and a capital T. Um, it must be complete. It must be whole. It must be one. Else it would truly not be absolute. If there was some absolute truth that was not a part of the capital A, capital T absolute truth, then the capital A, capital T absolute truth would not truly be absolute. And thus it must contain all truth that is absolute. And it is that. Again, we're using language to try and talk about this. The words themselves, absolute and the word truth, are merely linguistic symbols that we use attempting to convey meaning beyond the words themselves. That's what language is. Symbols that convey meaning beyond themselves. So to state that you know that the absolute truth to which the words absolute and truth are referring to say that that is absolute is as far as our conceptual and intellectual knowing of absolute truth can really go. That's the most that we can really say. Assuming that absolute truth cannot be entirely communicated through concepts or language, then the closest that language can really come to communicating the absoluteness of absolute truth is to say absolute truth is, and I know that it is, but I don't know what it is. So that's saying that on a conceptual level, you can understand that there is absolute truth and that you know that it is absolute, but outside of just that conceptual understanding, what it's referring to, you know, we don't really know what that is. What is that? That's what we're trying to get to. As with all language, there's always a reality attempting to be communicated and understood beyond the language that we're using to point toward it. And thus, to claim that you know absolutely that absolute truth is absolutely true does not also mean that you know what absolute truth is outside of that conceptual understanding. So, as far as me trying to communicate absolute truth, that puts me in a difficult spot. All I can really do is point towards what I'm talking about, try to use words to convey what it is. But in order for you to come to know what it is beyond just a conceptual, intellectual understanding, you have to directly experience it. That's the only way. So then we have to ask the question, can absolute truth be known outside of merely the conceptualization of it? And this is a very difficult question to answer because if the answer is yes, if it can be, um, then there would be no way to communicate this using language, really, because language itself is a conceptual means of communication. In addition to that, I'd like to point out that the mind functions on a conceptual level, purely conceptual. It can only comprehend intellectually things, concepts, objects, things with limits, boundaries. That's really all that the mind can intellectually process. But if absolute truth cannot be comprehended conceptually, then with what exactly would we be able to know it with, if not with the mind? This brings up another difficult question. Is an intellectual conceptual understanding the highest, or we could say the most fundamental form of knowing that we have access to? Or do we have the capacity to know things that are beyond the mind's ability to know them through intellectual and conceptual means? Which leads us to another difficult question, maybe a more fundamental question that we have to explore first before we can answer that. Who or what is that self that we claim to be, to which things are known? Because if we are the mind, if we can equate ourself to the mind, and the mind is limited to conceptual understanding, and if absolute truth is can only be known outside of conceptual understanding, then we as the mind would be unable to understand it, to comprehend it. But if we are something different than, more fundamental than, higher than, if we have something that is our self that is beyond the mind, metaphysical, then perhaps that is what we would have to use to get in touch with absolute truth. Again, going back to the who or what is this self that we claim to be, to which things are known, that I, then in regards to absolute truth, if we are the mind, then all that the mind can logically know about absolute truth is what I stated previously. However, like I say, if our self is more fundamental, then we wouldn't share the mind's conceptual limitations. And we might, in fact, have access to a knowing that is higher, that is more subtle, more fundamental, through which absolute truth could possibly be known. And if this is the case, then we would have to use that knowing that is beyond the mind in order to understand absolute truth. But does such a knowing exist, and what might that be? What would that knowing be? Because we're very familiar with the mind's way of knowing, but that's if there is a subtler way of knowing things, what is that? We could reason that if we are fundamentally some form of subjective observer or witness of experience and phenomena in the objective world, then that phenomena, which can be observed or witnessed, must be apart from that self, that subjective self to which they are known. So, through the process of elimination, we can rule out all observable phenomena as being not our fundamental self. And when I say observable phenomena, I'm talking about all things physical, known through sense perceptions. That's how we know the physical world, through sense perceptions. Emotions, which we know as internal states, and thoughts and ideas, which are known as mental states or images. And here we discover that if even our mental phenomena can be observed, then the mind must be apart from that self which is doing the observing of it. If you think about something, that thought comes and that thought goes, but you were there before that thought came, you were there while that thought was here, and you're there after it leaves. So what is that I that is there, even behind thoughts, even behind imagination, even behind dreaming? What is that self? Here, this kind of answers the previous quandary of whether we are limited to the conceptual knowing of our mind, or if we do, in fact, have an access to a higher knowing. This does not, however, answer the question of who or what we are as the subjective self, but instead just answers what we are not. And if we are unable to identify ourselves as an object which can be observed, then logically we must assume that the subjective self is not an object. It's not something that can be observed. If an object is considered to be something that is material or physical, something that is formed, tangible, phenomenal, something limited, definable, knowable, and or perceivable, and we are not any of the above things, then what we must be is immaterial, formless, intangible, nominal, no thing, unlimited, undefinable, unknowable, and imperceivable. And the mind does not like that. Hearing that, we often have a lot of resistance inside to thinking that we are any of those things. And yet, though the mind is incapable of knowing these things, nonetheless, we have some intuitive sense of self. We know that we are, but the mind does not know what we are because we are not a what that can be known by the mind. So we reach a difficult place where we've identified ourself as some sort of subjective observer or perceiver, which cannot itself be observed or perceived. Because we are not a what, the question, what am I, ceases to be an answerable question, at least by the mind. The best that we can do is ask, what am I not? And the mind will come up with all sorts of things that are separate from us, including everything that can be observed or perceived. But this awareness that we have, this awareness that we are, is able to be aware of all distinctions because it is free of distinction. It can be aware of limitation and space and time and phenomena because it is itself limitless, spaceless, timeless, and non-phenomenal or nominal, if that's how you pronounce it. um, and this awareness is the fundamental knowing which goes beyond the mind's ability to know. And it is this awareness that we are that knows that it is aware despite being unknowable by the mind. So if we have the capacity to know absolute truth beyond the mind's conceptual ability to know it, then it must be through this awareness that we are. This awareness which, by being aware, by being itself, is aware of itself and all things. So that's where I will end this video. I hope that you were able to follow this kind of logical process that I tried to take you through in trying to determine what is absolute truth and what does that have to do with me. So in my next video, I will be going more into depth into what could be called self-inquiry, or trying to get to the heart of who we are, what this awareness that we are is, if it has any qualities that I can communicate. But ultimately, I can only go so far with language and communication. And it will all come down to your personal experience and accessing that awareness yourself. And I may be able to help you do that and help you understand what it means to be this awareness, what this awareness actually is, and what relationship it has with absolute truth, and thus what relationship we have with absolute truth. So be prepared for some very deep stuff in the next video. I'm very excited to finally be sharing these things with you. And as I've said before, if this makes no sense, if you are utterly confused, that is okay. If you continue on your own spiritual path, it will make more sense the further down the road you get. So just come back when you're ready and do a lot of research on your own. Read about this topic, about awareness. Read the work of all sorts of teachers that are talking about this very thing and that have been for years. This is not a new teaching. This is not a new age philosophy. This is something that was understood by ancient peoples. And I'm merely trying to share the message that we've forgotten in our society. We need to refamiliarize ourselves with ourself, basically, and get rid of false understandings that we have built up over the years, that we've been taught, that we continue to be taught, and ways of thinking that really don't help us and aren't in line with actual truth, with actual reality. So we'll see where this takes us. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.